From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Salinger-Morris. It's Thursday, September 28. Rupert Murdoch has long been more than simply an uber-wealthy media magnate. As the owner of influential outlets like Fox News and a global stable of newspapers, he's helped put presidents in the White House, and in Canberra, take prime ministers out of Parliament House. So what will happen now to both the media and to politicians now that Murdoch has stepped down from his role leading both News Corp and Fox Corporation, and his son Lachlan Murdoch has taken over? Today, senior correspondent Anne Hyland on Fox's future under Lachlan.
All right, we have breaking news right now. Rupert Murdoch has now announced he is stepping down as the chairman of Fox Corporation and Fox
He says
News.
the companies are in robust health, as am I.
It's been a long-awaited question of what his plans were for the future, what his succession plan was. This is a big news today.
This is huge news. Rupert Murdoch saying...
Son Lachlan will now head both companies while Rupert Murdoch transitions to the role of Chairman Emeritus in mid-November. Let's bring in our North American Bureau Chief.
So, Anne, we know that last week Rupert Murdoch stepped down as chair of News Corp and Fox Corporation. There's been jostling over this role and who will take it for years now. And he's announced that he'll be handing over the reins to his son Lachlan. So what should we know about Lachlan, and do you think he's up for the job?
So Rupert has 6 children and Lachlan is the eldest son. And from an early age, Lachlan was pitted against his brother and sister to take over the family business, so to speak.
Backing of the powerful right-wing billionaire Rupert Murdoch, who oversees a business empire with his own children jockeying to take over, which is part of the inspiration for the hit HBO show Succession.
Lachlan, James and his sister Elizabeth all participated in the family business throughout the decades.
It was suggested that it was your dad's wish that Kendall take over as CEO.
And from when?
Oh, so he underlined recently?
Underlined or crossed out?
Shiv.
And they all vied for Rupert's attention and affection, and they all came and went, but it was Lachlan who really eventually came back into the fold, and he was sort of anointed a number of years ago to be the successor by becoming co-chair of News Corporation and co-chair of Fox Corporation, and then eventually CEO. Over the years, there's been lots of observers who've said that Lachlan was not the right person. It should have been Elizabeth or James running the businesses because they were more astute. Lachlan's had success with businesses that he's run on his own, such as Nova here in Australia. Even in the US more recently with Fox, he's invested in a streaming service called Tubi, which has actually been performed better than expectations. That said, he was also CEO of Fox News when the whole stolen election lie was promulgated, and that's cost them close to $1 billion. And he's had some poor investments such as OneTel and Ten over the years. Observers, like a number of years ago, like Ken Cowley, thought it should have been Elizabeth, but said that Rupert's old-fashioned views about women meant that she would never get to run the company. Other people like Geraldine Brooks and other observers think it should have been James. And then you've got people like Rod Tiffin, who's written books on Murdoch at the University of Sydney, saying this is not a corner store and it's not a Jane Austen novel where businesses, just because of family hereditary, should be passed on. These are 2 large public companies with enormous sway and influence, and so it really should be run not necessarily by a family member but by the best business person available for those CEO and chair roles. So is Lachlan up to it? I don't know whether we'll really be able to answer that question until Rupert passes, because right now, even though Rupert has stepped back, every decision he makes is going to be seen through the prism of his father in the background, still calling the shots. And then when Lachlan does eventually get that chance to run it on his own, who knows if his siblings will allow him to.
There's a reason why the family has inspired succession.
Yes.
And so I think one of the most important aspects of this whole story of Rupert Murdoch stepping down is what impact it might have on the political landscape. So first, what impact could Lachlan taking over from his father have in American politics on Donald Trump and whether he might win another term in the White House? Donald Trump's obviously currently the favored Republican nominee for the election next year. And Fox News, like you say, was instrumental in Trump's successful election in 2020. But then only a year ago, Rupert publicly criticized Trump and disowned him. So what might we see here?
It's an interesting question. I guess the first thing that we need to sort of understand is that Lachlan and Rupert see the world the same way, and that this was even only very recently pointed out by a former editor of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, in his memoir, where he said that Lachlan on some issues was more right-wing than his father. And so Lachlan's described himself as a libertarian. Also, in the recent announcement where Rupert said he would be stepping back from being chair of Fox Corp and News Corp to an emeritus chairman, he said that, like himself and like his father, Lachlan believed in the cause of freedom, which kind of means that they're committed to continuing fighting the culture wars and freedom of thought. So what does that mean for the US election? Look, Fox News is still very influential in the US, but there's a real problem, as you just made the point, Samantha, that Rupert has disowned Trump, and Trump has cost them dearly because, as you know, with Fox News, Fox promoted the lie and conspiracy theory that the 2020 election was stolen, which Trump was arguing. And they've been successfully sued for defamation by a voting machine manufacturer called Dominion. And that's cost them almost $1 billion US. And they're now being sued by a second voting machine manufacturer called Smartmatic. And the expectations are that suit will be settled. But it makes it very hard for the Murdochs to support Trump if he becomes the Republican candidate or nominee. He's certainly the front runner at the moment, and the Fox audience are still very much Trump supporters. So it's a bit of a mess.
Okay. And so officially we know Rupert Murdoch steps down in effect in mid-November. And you've mentioned that he's still likely to be calling the shots while he's still alive. We know his official title is going to be Emeritus Chairman. What does it actually mean? On paper, what is he meant to be doing now?
Well, it still gives him involvement in a business that he grew and created over 7 decades. So it still signals to shareholders that he still has an investment and will still be involved, but not in the day-to-day activities. So he's still going to be there in the background, wanting to be across broadly what the strategy of both companies are.
And this is asking you to speculate, but what about after Rupert dies? I mean, he's 92 at the moment. So do you have any thoughts, I guess, on what might happen in the Australian political landscape once Lachlan, assuming he's still in charge and Rupert's not in the background?
Well, Rupert, in recent days, just with the announcement, made a point of saying that he was in robust health. He's always said that he intends to live as long as his mother did, and she made it past 100. Though he has had health issues in recent years, that's to be noted. The question of what happens when Rupert does die, the family controls News Corp and Fox Corp through a trust, a family trust, and that family trust has 40% of the voting shares. And Rupert has 4 of the votes in that trust, and 4 of the eldest children have 4 votes. When Rupert dies, each of the 4 eldest children inherit a vote each from Rupert. So the question is, even though Lachlan is essentially Rupert's proxy. He's put him in there, and he's done a long apprenticeship through both companies. The question is whether his siblings will allow him to stay in that role, whether they want him in that role. And also, it may be that they want to sell some of the assets or all of the assets, as we saw with the Bancroft family that owned Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. Those assets had been in the family for a very long time. Eventually, family members wanted it sold. They wanted the money. Murdoch was the buyer, but potentially here you could see that with the Murdochs as well.
And it's interesting as well, I think, when it's left to the 4 oldest children, because James, I believe, has sort of split ideologically, I guess, from his family. He said, there are views I really disagree with on Fox News. That was 4 years ago. And I believe he has made even stronger statements, hasn't he, with regards to his differing views from his father?
That's right. And he's also been a donor to Biden's campaign. So it's a really complicated family affair, and it would really be anyone's guess how it goes in the next couple of years. But however it turns out, it's going to be fascinating.
And I want to turn to talk about what Lachlan's leadership might mean for Australia. Former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd once called Rupert Murdoch a cancer on democracy. So do you think Australian politicians will still be fighting against what they see as the Murdoch empire's right-wing agendas?
Interestingly, when I spoke to people who've written books on the Murdochs, such as Rod Tiffin from the University of Sydney, and also shareholders who own, like Airlie Funds Management, the head of equities there, he said that they own 2% of the voting shares. They don't expect any change in the stewardship of Fox or News Corporation in the time that Lachlan is at the top with Rupert still in the background. The only time we're likely to see any change is after Rupert dies. So in answer to your question, are we going to see any changes in the way that their news organisations approach ideas or the contest of ideas, which is what Rupert says he's all about, then no, it will be the same. And so for governments, it will be a continuation of what they've known for the past couple of decades.
Right, and I want to talk to you about some of the challenges that Lachlan will be facing. Fox is struggling to compete with bigger players such as Amazon and Netflix. Meanwhile, cable TV outlets are declining. So how do you think Lachlan will manage that?
It's a real challenge for him. In 2019, Rupert sold the 20th Century Fox assets, the movie business, the entertainment assets, for about $71 billion to Disney. So it became a smaller but still largely influential organisation. The question now is, where's its growth coming from? And analysts say, like Fox Corporation, they see the revenues are roughly about $15 billion at the moment. And in 4 years' time, they see that it's only being about $16 billion. So that's not looking great on the growth front. They're focused on, in the US, through their television assets, on news and sport. The question is, Fox News has been a cash cow. Can it still be that way, as the way that people access news is splintering and people are moving from mainstream television to streaming services? And the other question is around sports rights, which they've decided to focus on, or they've always focused on, but even more so now. They're competing against really deep-pocketed players now, such as Amazon and Apple and more traditional players like Warner Brothers and Comcast, who all want to own their sporting rights. So he's got some real challenges there as to people will be wanting to know, how do you grow this business? And then on the print side, there are a number of divisions amongst shareholders who say, well, print's in decline, get rid of this business. And yet their digital arms of those newspapers, some of them have been growing really, really well. Like the Wall Street Journal has almost 4 million subscribers. 85% of those are digital. And that business has some very high valuations placed on it by some people, such as saying that the Journal could be worth as much as $10 billion. That seems kind of on the high side. But then you'll have something like The Sun in the UK, which has really struggled to convert an audience digitally. And so the value of that's been written down to zero.
It's interesting because a lot of people in the media landscape know that Rupert Murdoch famously loves newspapers. He loves print. That's what he came from, of course, about 70 odd years ago. Started with one newspaper. And it makes me wonder, do you think that with Lachlan taking over, he might not be nearly as wedded to print, that those could be on the chopping block?
Is Lachlan as sentimental as his father about print? It's a really good question. Certainly, I had started as a cadet on the Courier Mail when Lachlan got his first job as a 22-year-old at General Manager of Queensland Newspapers in Brisbane, and he really was very enthusiastic about print. He loved walking the newsroom floor with his shirt sleeves rolled up like his father did. And he really enjoyed the whole process of, from the start to the finish, of how a newspaper came out. And at that time, he'd been put into Brisbane because they just made this hundreds of millions of dollars investment on colour printers. So you were going to see the paper come out with colour photographs and everything. Now, I think he's incredibly pragmatic, but there's still a lot of influence to be had through newspapers in their digital versions. And we've seen that in the UK, in the US and here in Australia, that those digital assets can still hold sway over public opinion, and particularly around election times. So does Lachlan want to lose that influence? That's the question. So while there might be this call from some shareholders to get rid of these, assets, it's the influence that the Murdochs have enjoyed for decades by owning them. It's an interesting question.
Thank you, Anne, so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.